Good evening. Good evening. You too. Good evening and welcome. This is going to be, I think, a very exciting and lively discussion tonight. I am Mary Beth Borthwick, a proud USC alum and the sixth vice regent for the state of California of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And some of you may know that we partner twice a year with the USC Saul Price School and present this lecture in the spring at SC and another in fall in Mount Vernon. So if you're ever at Mount Vernon in October, check our calendar and come and attend because it's equally wonderful. The association, for those of you that don't know that I haven't bored you with this fact, was founded in 1858, and its sole mission is to preserve and to protect George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, and to educate the world about the life and legacy of George Washington and why this matters as much today, perhaps more, than it did in his lifetime. Washington was no stranger to tonight's topic. He believed in free speech. In fact, one of his most famous speeches was a passionate one he gave to his officers in 1783 to dissuade them from rebelling. His support of free expression was clear and unequivocal. If men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, Washington said, the freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. And while Washington believed that morality could not be maintained without religion, he also championed freedom of religion, one of our most fundamental rights of free expression. Yet he also advised civility in speech, saying, the foolish and wicked practice of profane cursing and swearing is a vice so mean and low that every person of sense and character detests and despises it. I'm sure everyone here tonight can agree on the speaking respectfully to one another. And now, on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy Dean and the C. Irwin and Ione Piper Chair, Dean Christopher Boone. I speak for multitudes when I say how impressed I am with Dean Boone's thoughtful and strong leadership. He's been in the job about a year and a half, and you would have thought he had been here for much longer. So we are happy to have the Price School in good hands. And Dean Boone?
So I have the name tag here, so I am legit. I'm Chris Boone, just to be clear. Thank you, Mary Beth, for that amazing introduction and for the welcome. I really do appreciate it. And the one thing I will say is one of the most remarkable things about coming to USC was just how strong and dedicated and devoted the Trojan family is. It's really something that's quite extraordinary, and I feel that every day. So thank you for the support that you've given over the many years for this extraordinary lecture series, the George Washington Leadership Lecture Series. We were just talking before this event and talking about the remarkable array of speakers and thoughts and ideas that have been discussed here in this beautiful facility at USC and in Mount Vernon. And if you do get a chance to visit Mount Vernon, I highly recommend it. It's extraordinary, not just for the house, but the library and other facilities that they built there. And you have to see the cherries. Everyone knows about the cherries, right? The preserved cherries. I want to see those. Still mind-blowing that they were discovered almost 250 years after they were buried. So a couple of things that I want to note is this series is, first of all, thanks to the generosity of Mary Beth Borthwick and her husband Hal. So thank you both again for supporting it. Yes, appreciate it. And Mary Beth touched on this, and it's something that's really important not only to USC, but to the Saul Price School of Public Policy, and that's the dedication to academic freedom and to free speech. And we have a couple of experts here tonight that Jeff will be introducing, Rikki Schlott and Ian Rosenberg. I had a chance to talk to just a few moments ago. I'm really interested in their thoughts this evening. I think we're in for a real treat. The other thing that I want to bring up is USC is dedicated to the notion of academic freedom and free speech, which is, as you know, is something that's come under a lot of attack recently. And one of the ways that our new president, Byung-Soo Kim, is addressing that is through something called the Open Dialogue Project. This is a really important principle to him as the president of the university. And Neeraj Sood, where's Neeraj? There he is. Neeraj is leading that, so thank you, Neeraj. He's a professor in the Price School of Public Policy. So we thank Neeraj, as well as the president, for his dedication to what I think is absolutely critical and necessary, especially at a college and university. If this is not a place where we can't exchange in the marketplace of ideas, I can think of no better place to do that, especially for people in their younger years, in their formative years, giving them an opportunity to listen to others who they do not agree with, but to develop some understanding of why they might hold the viewpoints that they do. Maybe not necessarily to agree or to fully compromise, but at least to understand that there's different ways of thinking and knowing about the world. This is a time and this is a place where this should happen, and the Open Dialogue Project, I think, is a fantastic example of dedication to those principles. These evenings take a lot of work, as you might imagine. So I want to thank a couple of individuals. Nicole, where are you? You're around here somewhere. Are you hiding behind? Is she outside? All right. Well, we'll thank Nicole later. And then Erica Burnell at the back. Thank you, Erica, for everything that you've done to make this evening possible. So the next person to come up is another faculty member in the Price School of Public Policy. Jeff Jenkins has taken over this important role from David Sloan. Some of you may remember David from years past. Jeff brings extraordinary expertise to this role and also to this topic tonight as well. He's the USC Price Provost Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and Law. He's also the Maria B. Crutcher Professor of Citizenship and Democratic Values. So he knows a thing or two about tonight's topic. And so Jeff's going to come up and introduce the speakers tonight and then moderate the discussion. Jeff, please.
Thanks much to Mary Beth and the Borthwick family. Thanks to Dean Boone. Thanks to all of you for turning out today. So I have the same quote by George Washington here, right? So I'm going to, because it's so important, I'm going to read it a second time. So in 1783, as a young nation stood at a crossroads, George Washington issued a stark warning to his officers that resonates with even greater urgency today. And he said, "For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and, dumb and silent, we may be led, like sheep, to the slaughter." Washington understood that free speech is not just a polite social custom, but a vital defense mechanism for our free people. He argued that once we lose the ability to openly debate the serious and alarming consequences of our time, we lose the very faculty of reason that makes us human. Today we find ourselves at another crossroads. The tools of our sentiments have changed, from hand-printed pamphlets to global digital networks, and artificial intelligence. Yet the fundamental danger remains the risk of being led in silence by those who would curate, moderate, or suppress the truth. Our panel today is here to honor Washington's legacy by doing exactly what he championed, offering our sentiments on the most pressing issues of our age. We are here to ensure that in an ever-changing world, we remain anything but silent. Please join me in welcoming our experts. Ian Rosenberg is a media lawyer with over 25 years of experience specializing in First Amendment, libel, and intellectual property law. He's also an adjunct associate professor at Brooklyn College, where he teaches media law to graduate students. Previously, he was an assistant chief counsel advising ABC News and an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker. He is the author of The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms, the nonfiction graphic novel, Free Speech Handbook, and the forthcoming Terrible Stuff Damaging Everybody, the true stories of lies and libel in Dominion v. Fox. He lives in New York City with his family. Rikki Schlott is a Cato Media Fellow, author, and columnist at the New York Post. Her writing focuses on free speech, campus culture, and civil liberties, as well as generational issues, relationships, and evolving cultural norms. Her commentary has been featured in Reason, Newsweek, and the National Review, and she's appeared on the BBC, News Nation, Fox News, and HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. That's what I'm jealous of right there. She's the co-author of The Canceling of the American Mind with Fire President and CEO Greg Lukianoff, and is currently working on a forthcoming nonfiction project. She also lives in New York City. So please join me in welcoming Ian and Rikki. So I have a bunch of questions, right? And we're not going to be able to get to them all. We'll get to some of them. And I tried to include questions that would really bring in the expertise of both of the panelists and questions that I found interesting as well. So one of the first questions, and it's a transitional question, and we'll go back to Washington. So Washington warned of being silenced by those in power. In our modern era, is the greatest threat to free speech still the government? Or is it now the social pressure to remain, as Washington said, dumb and silent to avoid public backlash? Why don't we start with Ian?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the Mount Vernon Society and USC for inviting us. It's really great, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I think the answer to your question for me is quite clear, that the greatest threat to free expression today is the government, and not just in theoretical concepts, but actually the Trump administration and their concerted efforts and repeated efforts to stifle free expression in the news media, in entertainment, internationally, and at the university level. I think that we are really in danger right now of losing our rights, particularly those that we might not know the extent of our rights. So in The Fight for Free Speech, my book, I take 10 contemporary free speech controversies and questions and talk about how those questions are answered by the story of 10 cases that reached the Supreme Court and defined our rights in this area. So I've been very invested in the project of people knowing about their rights for a long time. And I do feel that while free speech values are important, that our values really need to be shaped by a knowledge of what our rights are, and that in this time of change and this time of, I would say, an assault on our First Amendment rights, that the most important thing we can do is to be aware of them and therefore hopefully be able to defend them.
I would say I agree with you that the government is increasingly a massive threat to free expression, but just to be a contrarian, I will say that I also think that our societal understanding and exercise of free speech values is consistently degrading. I think my generation, being an elder Gen Zer, has not really done the best job of upholding that tradition. And a reason that I would say this is because a lot of nations do have what would look like excellent free speech principles on the books and laws on the books, including North Korea, Russia, and Turkey. And that doesn't really matter unless it's functionally carried out both by the courts and also by people in their everyday dialogue and conversation. And I think a lot of the issues you've been seeing in academia, a lot of issues even in social media and our discourse breaking down are all demonstrations of the fact that, to your point, a lot of people are not even fully aware of the free speech values that make being an American such a profound blessing in the scheme of human history.
So is this a critical time? I mean, is this an odd time? I'm kind of a political historian, right? And whenever anybody brings up something bad is happening today, I can almost always find some parallel not too far in the past, right? Are we in an exceptional period with regard to the dangers to free speech?
Well, I can jump in first and say, in my perspective, unequivocally, yes. That the threats to free expression, I believe, right now are greater than at any time in American history since the McCarthy era. So it's not unprecedented. And the history of free speech, starting really in the 1920s, when the court first began to really put some meat on the bones of the First Amendment, has been, of course, a history of the repression of free speech and us not necessarily living up to our values. So I don't want to be naive in saying that everything was wonderful until this moment that we're at right now, but I also think that we are in a categorically different moment in time.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that we're in this tremendously uncomfortable period of growing pains with social media and so many new voices entering the discourse in a way that we're just not culturally attuned to yet. And in the wake of the printing press's invention, there were hundreds of years of religious war, and I think if you were born in that moment, you might say that that was not going to be worth it in the scheme of things. And of course, we know that that is the case. But what happens when you have so many new voices in the conversation is, new debates, new dialogues, challenges to power, and I think a real epistemic crisis. And we've not yet entered a period where we know how to use social media and use this more robust discourse in a productive way. And in the same way that there were concerns about misinformation and pamphleteering in the wake of the printing press's invention, I think obviously we're at a very similar moment right now with technology and social media.
I mean, so let me continue to push back on this, right? So is this just another issue of really smart people, the chattering class, right, on social media, who think there's a problem? Do people in the everyday world, let's say outside the gates of USC, do they feel this as well?
Well, if I'm going to go first, I would say that I think people are aware of the pressures on the media. And when I talk about the attacks on the media, I, of course, have been somebody who's worked as a media lawyer for most of my career, but I'm not just speaking about defending the group of institutions that I have worked with or the news media in general. Attacks on the media are the first wave of attacks on our free expression rights as individuals. And the media is really a proxy for the ability to speak to power. I would say that people are quite aware, for example, of Jimmy Kimmel being taken off the air after pressure from FCC Chair Brendan Carr, and then ABC's capitulation to that pressure. And in fact, we know this to be the case because in large part, Kimmel was only reinstated because so many people not only spoke out in the creative community, which, okay, is maybe one elite, but also regular people who have no connection to news or entertainment, who canceled their subscriptions to Hulu and Disney+. That is the reason Disney changed course. And so I don't think this is just First Amendment lawyers and news people and entertainment figures who are concerned about what's going on. I think people are aware of a real sea change that is happening. Yes, the president, no matter what president you're talking about, has always had a difficult and tough relationship with the media. Yes, there has always been an effort to diminish the media so that presidents can talk directly to the American people without moderation or without critique. But I think that people are beginning to ask, how is this different and what are my rights in connection with these efforts to curtail expression?
Yeah, I would also say that I think it's showing up in everyday life in a profound way that's impossible to ignore. Like our Thanksgiving dinners are turning into ideological teardowns because our sons are listening to Nick Fuentes and our daughters are going to the far left, and we're all living in our own little media ecosystems and are no longer seeing eye to eye with fellow Americans who might be our neighbors or our classmates. And I think that's impossible to ignore, even if you're not looking at it from the sort of on high values of free expression. Our social connections are being torn apart by the fact that we don't have healthy discourse and we don't have a healthy way to situate ourselves in this new media ecosystem.
Okay, I'm going to continue on this theme. You stole my FCC question, but
I
that's
can
okay.
say a lot more about the FCC if you'd like.
So let's move to rights versus responsibilities. If the legal right to speak remains intact, but the social cost of speaking, like losing your job or your bank account, becomes too high for the average person to pay, has our culture effectively canceled the First Amendment? How do we balance a speaker's right to dissent with the public's right to hold them responsible for the harm their words might cause? Let me start with Rikki this time.
I mean, I think that certainly, functionally, if speech is chilled and we don't feel comfortable expressing ourselves and we're self-censoring, which we know that the vast majority of students are doing on campus, the vast majority of professors are doing on campuses, in these bastions of free speech and free expression where that is exactly where it's supposed to be happening in our discourse. And particularly, I think young people who grew up with social media and have a digital footprint going back to the time that they were 10, are very aware of the fact that there's always kind of the looming threat that something might come back to bite you, or the fashionable political takes might shift and you've been left behind, and maybe your college acceptance is rescinded or you lose a job on account of that. I mean, I think functionally, yes, certainly my generation is self-censoring to an alarming degree, and it's because they've seen what's around them and the fact that we're living in a culture that extends very little grace to people, even if we do have the legal right to express ourselves.
Do you think it's asymmetric? Do you think conservative students are self-censoring more than liberal students?
I think that was the case. I would say it's changed since I was on campus myself. I do think that there's this robust new right among young people, some of whom I'm kind of concerned are even more extreme than the people on the left that we were talking about as the boogeymen of campuses. But I would say that a lot of that discourse for several years made it seem as though free speech is a conservative issue. I think in the wake of October 7th, a whole different crowd of people felt as though their free speech rights were violated, and it was demonstrated to many people that free speech is not a partisan issue. I think that it has shifted pretty considerably, and a new faction of people are interested in that value, because we've seen the right and the left have their speech and expressive rights violated recently.
Well, Rikki is the expert on cancel culture, so I will defer to you on that. But I just want to make sort of 2 points about cancel culture, which perhaps put me in it from a different perspective. One is that so often we tell people, particularly minorities, that they have to put up with hate speech, that they have to put up with slurs, that they have to put up with things that might go to their very identity, because that is the nature of the First Amendment, and I do believe that. But when then they act in response to that by saying, I disagree with the speaker, I don't want to buy this book, I don't want to watch this television show, we then say, oh no, that's also not okay. That's cancel culture. But I would argue that that is part of the marketplace of ideas, that the exchange of views does not mean, one of the things I suspect that we'll get to more often today is that freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. So I am perfectly comfortable with people facing consequences for their actions, as I talk about in my book, that most of the First Amendment victories we will have are about the victories of their rights, but did not mean that those people didn't suffer any consequences. In fact, they usually suffered many. I would also just like to add that, that too often I think we are letting the term cancel culture sort of be used for anything that someone doesn't like when they say something that is unpopular. So when Senator Josh Hawley says that I'm being canceled by Random House because his book deal was taken away after he refused to certify Biden's election and arguably supported the insurrectionists, that's not cancel culture. That is a reaction, and Hawley was a clerk for Chief Justice Roberts, so he certainly knows the law, and I think is just purposely trying to extend a blanket to cover himself that does not really apply. It is not, no one has a First Amendment right to a novel from Random House. If so, I would love to sign up for that. And also, it is not a First Amendment violation, we can talk about this more in a minute, when private actors do something to you. The First Amendment only applies to government speech. So we can talk about that.
I would also
more.
say that I agree with you. Cancel culture as a term is sometimes cringeworthy, the way that it's been dragged through the mud. Vladimir Putin said that he was canceled as a result of invading Ukraine.
Yeah.
So obviously, it's both the people who cancel are violating free speech norms, but also often people who are not able to back up their points or respond to or retort are misusing free expression and hiding behind the veil of cancel culture. I agree that the term is often misapplied.
Yeah, and I know you talk about those other examples in your book as well.
So let me push you on this, Ian. So as you say, the First Amendment stops the government from punishing you.
Yeah.
But if a few massive banks and tech platforms can effectively disappear a person from the economy for their legal speech, has the private sector become more powerful than the Constitution?
Well, I don't know that the private sector is more powerful than the government. I would still always be more concerned about the government taking action against a university, for example, than, and we don't need to look, for example, for the current administration's attacks on the university have had dramatic impacts on the premier universities in this country. And big tech and big banks have not been able to in any way sort of take away funding or put universities on their heels in other regards the way that the government has. And just maybe a moment so that we're all clear on terms. So, of course, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. All state actors, so that's not only public officials, but any type of government, state or local. So when we are talking about that the First Amendment doesn't apply to big tech, I think that actually can be a good thing because in the government context, the government has to have viewpoint neutrality. That's one of the core principles of First Amendment law, that the government can't preface one idea or over another. And in fact, the government can't even regulate false speech. The Supreme Court has held in a series of cases about stolen valor laws that were designed for the good purpose of trying to prevent people from lying about a military record or awards that they don't have. The Supreme Court even said that that type of speech that type of law was unconstitutional because it is the government trying to define truth. However, the fact that tech companies are not constrained by those First Amendment limitations means that they can police false statements online, and they can also police threats and other types of dangerous speech. So I actually think that the balance works pretty well, and I would not be inclined to say that we should be somehow shifting that.
You think they've done a good job of policing?
No. No, and I don't want to be here as an apologist for big tech. There's obviously huge numbers of problems, but I don't think that the problem is the constitutional structure around them. I think the problem is, multifaceted and sort of getting to be out of my area. But I would not say that they've done a good job.
So let me take you to the campus now. Universities in the 21st century often find themselves trying to balance the emotional safety of students with the academic necessity of exposing them to challenging or even offensive viewpoints. Is it possible for a university to be both a safe space and a place for dangerous ideas?
I think it really depends on how you define a safe space, and unfortunately everyone defines it in a different way, which I think is part of what the problem is. A lot of students will say that they feel unsafe in the presence of viewpoints that just differ from them, which is obviously not a healthy thing. However, I would say that most schools have decent and robust protections in their student handbook against overt harassment. I think the lines are pretty well drawn. But I think that what universities can do, and what, in my opinion, they've failed to do in recent times, is really orient young people who've not been given the sort of civic education in high school in the values of free speech when they arrive on campus, and teach them what safety really means, which is not being protected from ideas that make you uncomfortable. That's the whole point of being here. And I've been heartened to see that recently a lot of schools have been creating these free speech orientations, because I think part of why these campus protests went so off the rails in 2023 was in part because students weren't quite clear on what their expressive rights were, where those ended. So I think you can create a more respectful environment when everyone's on the same page about what free expression is, where the line is drawn, and from there, hopefully more people will feel safe. But unfortunately, you can't create a safe space for everyone because everyone's line is going to be in a different place.
Well, I agree with that, but I also think that in some ways it's a false dichotomy, that we can have both a concern about people's emotional well-being and challenging and difficult material. I don't think there's any free speech or First Amendment problems with trigger warnings, with giving students an awareness of the type of controversial or difficult material that's about to happen in a class. And I think sometimes that can provide a more helpful frame for dealing with that type of material. But I would, of course, say that we should have robust First Amendment protections, both in the world and in the country and on campus, for what Justice Holmes called freedom for the thought we hate. There's many reasons, that's sort of the whole crux of the marketplace of ideas, but one of the things I like to point out is one reason why we should protect the thought we hate today is because the thought we hate today may become the truth of tomorrow. I think too often protest culture in history takes on a rosy glow of inevitability. But if you look at, for example, Gallup polls at the time of Dr. King's March on Washington, the majority of Americans at that time opposed both Dr. King's message and the march. So dissent is always or almost always unpopular. And I think that we cannot eliminate what is considered outrageous or difficult or even objectively hateful speech out of the idea that some things are just too strong for the protection of the First Amendment.
So let me take you, and we touched on this question already, let me take you from the campus to social media. So, and we're all on social media, right? Everybody in this room, right? It's hard to avoid, right? I'm an old guy like me. I'm just on Facebook and X.
I saw that you were not on Instagram, Jeff, when I was posting about this event.
I am not much on Instagram. I'm not on Snapchat. I'm not on whatever, right? But I'm on a little bit. But I'm aware that they exist. I'm on the ones that I mentioned, and they've gotten in trouble, right, in the last couple of years. So let me just ask you this. So should social media platforms as private entities have the right to moderate content at their discretion, or have they become a digital town square that requires stricter protection of all speech?
I mean, I think absolutely they should have the right to, and we're doing a lot of trial and error in the social media era of what level of censorship is healthy. Obviously, there needs to be some line. I think that early days of Elon Musk acquiring X and just opening up the floodgates demonstrated that there is a need for some basic fundamental rules. However, before he acquired X, there was also a consistent wave of banning accounts that were considered fringe and far right and Proud Boys and all these odious groups that certainly I am not endorsing by any means. But I think what we are experiencing right now with this resurgence of extreme ideology and right-wing thought among particularly young people and young men is in part because we said, oh, that's out of sight, out of mind, that's not in our public square digitally anymore. And it went to Rumble, it went to Gab, it went to these alternative sources where people had just all validation of their viewpoints, and it festered. And censoring people does not make those opinions go away. Often it makes them come back with a vengeance, which I think is what we're experiencing right now. So I do think it's healthy that we are trying out different levels of moderation and seeing where that leaves us. But certainly I don't think any private company should be compelled to platform any speech that's beyond the pale for them. And the emergence of all these alternative platforms, I think, is a demonstration of the fact that there is not one town square. We probably would have said that Twitter was the town square recently, and now it's X. I don't think we would say that that's our cultural center anymore.
So when you think of a marketplace of ideas, that includes hateful ideas.
I think hate speech is legal in the United States. I think that unfortunately we've banished it, and now it's become a lot more mainstream. And sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think it's actually a useful utility to know what as many people in your society as possible believe, because oftentimes you can get blindsided by a brand new political faction or a brand new group if we completely stigmatize people and push them aside because they're considered too fringe. Often they come back with a vengeance.
Well, I think it's helpful to spend a minute talking about what our social media rights are. Again, our legal rights rather than perhaps our values. In my book, I talk about the case of Packingham, which involved a law, a West Virginia law North Carolina law that criminalized the access to social media and the internet, even for sex offenders. And it goes up to the Supreme Court, and in a decision, one of Justice Kennedy's last decisions, certainly his last significant speech decision, he talked about how we could not limit social media rights, even for such odious members of our society, because they were too fundamental a part of the modern public square of our modern free speech rights today. And Justice Kennedy referred to this world as the vast democratic forums of the internet, and surely did view those social media platforms as like a digital square or a modern town crier on steroids. And so we know that our rights to social media are pretty strong. Again, then on the flip side of that, social media companies have no requirements, no First Amendment obligations whatsoever as private companies. And I think that, and the court has rejected efforts to try and view them as utilities or some other kind of entity that could be regulated. So I think we are in a world where there is going to be no significant changes to the ability of social media to be forced to regulate speech in some kind of way. So we have to advocate for the type of change that we want on social media. Sometimes the First Amendment is not the solution, and I think this is one of those cases.
Okay, let me take you now to press freedom. We finally got there.
My favorite issue.
So less than a week ago, a federal judge, Paul Friedman, blocked a new Pentagon policy that would have allowed the government to revoke journalist press passes if they solicited unauthorized information. What does this ruling tell us about the current health of freedom of the press?
Well, it's a fantastic decision from Judge Friedman. I would commend anyone who wants to get wonky to read it. It's a stirring endorsement of free press principles. But let's also just talk about for a minute what that policy actually entailed. It not only, so unauthorized information sounds like, well, maybe I'm okay with that, but that actually included any information, even non-confidential information, that wasn't approved by the press office of the Pentagon. So it was such a draconian and outrageously sweeping order that essentially every member of the Pentagon Press Club turned in their badges and refused to sign it. And that is both the New York Times, the AP, but also Fox News also refused to sign it. So Judge Friedman found that it violated both Fifth Amendment due process rights because the policy was too vague, as well as First Amendment rights because he said it was basically a viewpoint discrimination effort to eliminate a press pool that he felt was hostile to Hegseth and the administration. So on the one hand, hooray, it's an excellent decision. The Pentagon has said that they would seek an appeal as soon as possible. It's not clear yet if they are going to follow through with that. But I don't think, unfortunately, that this is a sign of the health of our free press right now. I think it is yet another important example about how this administration has tried in every different way they can, well, perhaps not every, but in as many different ways as they can, to eliminate dissenting views. And that is often the media. And the very fact that for the first, we're talking about is this, some different moment in history, there's, again, always been an adversarial interaction between the press and the Pentagon, but this is the first time in American history when badges or access to the Pentagon was conditioned on essentially saying that you would only speak to the press officers of the Pentagon. So once again, this is a categorically different effort, and the fact that we the media, won in conjunction with this one district court decision does not give me the confidence that I would like to have to say that we are in a safe space for the media today. And to the contrary, I think it's just another indication of how much the media is under attack.
Yeah, I would say that this is one of many disturbing instances of the Trump administration pushing the line and seeing where the courts might give or how far they can go. Obviously, as a journalist myself, I think that's hugely concerning. I think regardless of your opinion on the administration, it could be applied by a future president to completely different journalists and completely different press passes. It's pretty disappointing that right now it seems like the White House has been swamped by podcasters covering what's going on there. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that you said, that it's an enormous threat. And I think, unfortunately, in my view, the administration knows exactly what they're doing. They know that they're pushing the line. They know that they're probably going to be losing in court, or at least very heartily challenged, and they continue to do it. I think it's probably one of many more similar threats that we'll see in this 4 years.
Okay, let me keep you in the same domain, but we'll switch to the topic of strategic lawsuits. So we're seeing a rise in what are called SLAPP suits, S-L-A-P-P, strategic lawsuits against public participation, where powerful figures sue journalists or even private citizens, not necessarily to win, but to bankrupt them through legal fees. With recent push to open up libel laws, are we moving toward a legal system where only the wealthiest media outlets can afford to report the truth?
Well, let me talk. All things I love to talk about. Let me talk for a minute about when you referenced opening up libel laws. That's something that Trump said as a candidate in the first time he ran for president, that he wanted to open up libel laws so that the media can't lie and get away with it. Let me just spend a minute to say that that is not the case, that the key standard comes from New York Times versus Sullivan, which is a case that created the actual malice standard. And the actual malice standard means that the media is protected even if they make a small mistake when talking about public figures, as long as they don't engage in knowing falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. So knowing falsity is lies, and reckless disregard for the truth is sort of you refuse to look at something that even someone gives you. So there is no blanket protection for the media for knowing lies, and that's just not true. So going then to these, so I don't think it's a change based on our libel standards or a need to change our libel standards. I think what we are facing is, once again, President Trump is the first president in American history to talk about differences, the first president in American history to sue a media entity while in office. He began that by suing the Wall Street Journal over an article that alleged he had sent a bawdy note to Jeffrey Epstein. I think it was $15 billion that he sued the Wall Street Journal for. Again, owned by, of course, Rupert Murdoch, his on-again, off-again friend. And then Trump sued the New York Times and Random House and some journalists regarding a mix of issues, including that he didn't like that one of the articles said that Mark Burnett, the reality show impresario, had discovered Trump regarding his inheritance of his family wealth, and negative remarks that had been made by his estranged niece, Mary Trump, and his former chief of staff, John Kelly. So that's now another, I believe, $15 billion against the Times, and then another $1 billion lawsuit against the BBC regarding an inappropriate edit to a documentary about Trump and the insurrection. So to answer your question, I think that we are facing a moment when the risks for journalists and the risks for the mainstream media are indeed beginning to are being used. The risks are increasing to such a degree that people are maybe not getting out of the business of reporting, but that they are reevaluating the type of reporting that they're going to do. And I think this goes to the point Rikki just made about the Trump administration sort of knows what they're doing. If they win with a judge, then they win, and if they lose with a judge, they still win because they've already engaged in a chilling effect and have been ratcheting up the stakes. So I do think it is a very dangerous time for the media.
Let me ask you a follow-up on this question. If a person is sued into silence, is that just cancel culture with a law degree? How does the threat of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit change what an average person is willing to post online?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually an enormous issue, and I sort of have a perspective as a journalist myself. I'm working for the New York Post, which is part of News Corp. Often, sometimes in ways that surprise me, my articles have to go through legal review and over and over and over, and we can afford to do that because we're part of News Corp. I have friends who are, prominent independent media, like Substackers, and they pay their own bills and they get their subscription fees, and they've been really pummeled by lawsuits, often that are completely frivolous, and you still are on the line for your legal fees. And I personally know some people who have just decided this topic is not worth touching, even if they're still being responsible. So I think that's extremely dangerous for the media and for what people are willing to do. And often those independent writers are bringing such a utility and value because they have their own viewpoints. They're not beholden to any larger corporate interest. And unfortunately, those are the people that are the most vulnerable.
So on the topic of free speech, what are we not talking about? What are some of the big issues that maybe are not getting enough attention?
I feel like that the issues that we're talking about today are not getting enough attention. But to come up with a new one, I think one of the things that we have to be worried about is not just what is happening with this administration, but how the norms are being busted open for the future. So while we may survive the end of this administration, I think when we have now made it acceptable to call the media the enemy of the people, when we have now made it acceptable for the President of the United States to sue the media, when we have now made it acceptable to say that two talk show hosts, should not be able to continue in their job because of political jokes, I think we have changed, this goes into free speech values, but I think we have our laws are holding on, but I think our free speech values are decreasing in a way that bodes very ill for the future. Because there's a common truism that the Supreme Court doesn't have an army. So in other words, that the Supreme Court really can't enforce their actions in any way, and it's just based on respect for the institutions. And I think the decline of respect for institutions like the judiciary and the mainstream media and the ability to take a joke are really worrisome, not just for right now, which I think people are talking about, but also for the future.
I would say that one issue I think is not really being looked at in a nuanced way is regulating social media access. I think there's a lot of very well-meaning conversation about young people online. I've written extensively about my own experience and why I think we need new cultural norms around technology. And 11-year-olds probably shouldn't be on Instagram, but also what does it mean if we introduce an age-gating technology that requires all of us to upload our IDs every time we want to access the internet? Are we taking away anonymity of speech and anonymity of just browsing even? And you need to look no further than the UK and Australia to see how that's been going. It's absolutely disastrous. In the UK, they implemented an age-gating law for social media access, and almost instantaneously, several platforms began to censor all war coverage out of Gaza, all war coverage out of Ukraine for anyone who had not uploaded a government-issued ID. Discord, 70,000 government IDs were leaked almost instantaneously in a cyber attack. Do you want your texting platform to have access to your whole identity and potentially expose you to identity theft? I don't think so. They're even looking at potentially banning VPNs for anonymous browsing or browsing as though you're in a different country in England. And I think even though I agree with a lot of the sentiment about protecting children online, it very quickly becomes a slippery slope that threatens the digital expression of all Americans.
I 100% agree. And there's a law, again, this is not a theoretical problem. There's a law in Texas right now that requires age gating out of a desire to protect, for young people, out of a desire to protect children from online sexual harm. But the law is so sweeping that it also requires age gating for the New York Times and essentially every news platform. A number of news organizations have joined amicus briefs to oppose that type of legislation, just for the reasons that Rikki brings up. So even though people aren't talking about it, that type of restrictions are happening right now in this country.
Okay, we might have some questions from the audience soon. Let me ask one more question here, and I'll take the cards here. One of the topics that's on everybody's mind, especially at a university, is AI, the growth of AI, artificial intelligence. How do we teach with it? What is fair to use in terms of research, right? Can we use AI to actually write our papers for us or help us write our papers? There's also the legal issues, right? How does AI-driven content moderation change our relationship with free expression?
Well, from a legal perspective, I'll let you do more of the culture and campus analysis, but from a legal perspective, I think there's sort of two things to focus on. First, the more algorithms sort of determine how we receive information, the more, I would say, vital it becomes that we have a news media that is also engaged with human oversight of analysis and giving people true and objective facts. There's a book written by NYU Press from about 8 years ago called Algorithms of Oppression that talks about how algorithms can have inherent, often racial biases. And I think that is a real concern. Just in terms of AI and the First Amendment, I think that Eugene Volkov and other professors have said, and I agree, that the degree to which AI's speech should be protected, we shouldn't be thinking too much about the AI or even the creators of AI, but instead about people's right to receive information. And so AI speech should be protected, not to win favor with our future AI overlords, but because we care about the ability, and the Supreme Court has defended the ability to receive information as a First Amendment right.
I would say I have no idea how academia should respond to this challenge, but one thing I know for certain is that young people will be handicapped if they're completely robbed of tools that will ultimately help some people succeed in the workforce, and there's got to be some level of integration, definitely not when you're writing your paper, but I think learning to use AI in a smart way is hugely competitive in the professional world right now, and being able to augment yourself in a smart way and still draw from your critical thinking skills and resources and not allow them to be degraded. It's a massive thing to balance. And another thing about AI that I think about, which is sort of about free expression, but not really, is just how concerning it is that already we're seeing that the way that we use language is being shaped by the patterns of AI and algorithms, and terms and phrases that AI favors or ChatGPT favors are now coming out of our mouths more often.
Give me an example. Is there an example?
Yes, it's when if you say, it's not this, but it's this. AI does that all the time and constructs sentences that way. And apparently, we're actually starting to mimic the speech patterns of these LLMs. And obviously, it's not about free expression exactly, but what does that do to our expression and the way that we think, even, especially for kids that grow up with it? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a good question here from the students, I guess. For students among us, what do our speakers see as the bright spots in the progression of free speech, if not now, then in the future?
Well, I think that good to try and look on the bright side. I think even in dark times, I think that the good news with free expression is that we have far more rights than I think most people are aware of. And many of these rights, thinking about it from a student's perspective, many of these rights came about because of student advocacy. Going back to the 60s and Mary Beth Tinker, middle school student who wore an armband to protest the war, one of the chapters in my book, the Supreme Court ultimately held that free expression and the First Amendment do not stop at the schoolhouse gates, and that there's a right to reasonable, non-disruptive protest, or only sort of mildly disruptive protest. So I think students will find that their free speech rights, that their right to protest, and that their right to sort of engage in a culture where people have different views and that should be celebrated rather than challenged, is really so much about the promise of the future. Social media and students today are certainly the future of First Amendment law. I would say look to the past, and you will see that you actually have a lot of tools, as long as they're not taken away from you, to advocate for what you believe in.
This might be like a slightly cynical answer, but I do feel as though in recent years it was seen that free speech is a conservative issue, and it's talking about kids on campuses self-censoring or social media censorship. I think because the current administration has been so egregious in terms of the way that they treat and respect the First Amendment, now that's no longer the case that it's just a conservative issue. I think that we've seen assaults on free expression and free speech culture from the left and now from the right in very rapid succession, and it's hammered home to a lot of people that this is not a partisan issue. This is these are principles that can protect all of us in different contexts, and so I think strange bedfellows and new alliances will come from an era where both sides of the political spectrum have disrespected free speech.
I don't find that cynical. I find that optimistic, actually.
Hopefully. We'll see.
Let me ask one more question, and again, this is also from students in the room, and this has to do with, their futures, right? A viral post today, as a student, can mean a rescinded job offer tomorrow. Should political expression be a protected class in labor law to prevent this kind of private sector silencing?
no would be my answer. Protected classes are very limited in the constitutional context, and there has to be both a sort of minority status and also a status, a sort of documented history of oppression. So I don't see that as a helpful change. And also, I have a lot of free speech things I worry about. I don't worry about the fact that societal norms may make people more reluctant to think a little bit more before they post something. I think we could all benefit from thinking another minute or two before we post something, whether we're being clear, whether we're expressing a viewpoint that we think is important, and whether we think that this is the way we want not only our grandma, but also our potential employers to think about us. Again, because of the First Amendment doesn't apply to private companies. Private companies can do what they want, but I think students today and young people today are already aware that there are reasons to think twice. And to me, that type of hesitation isn't really a free speech area of concern that I stay up at night worrying about.
So I would say the difference between you and I is that I had an iPhone when I was 10.
Yes.
So I am very sympathetic to these concerns of sometimes digital footprints that you're not even fully aware of as an adult, and things that you posted a decade or more ago, I think are certainly a major concern. There have been plenty of instances of people being canceled for tweets or posts from when they were teenagers, and I don't think anyone who did not grow up with technology, if you remember your teenage self, would you like if all of your thoughts and ideas were immortalized forever? Or someone might have a screenshot from a text conversation from forever ago that you forgot you even had. Just recently, I think it's a demonstration that both the left and the right really like to do this. Zohran Mamdani's wife's tweets from when she was like 15 were going around as though they were a reflection of her character today. And I think that's a massive problem. It's a demonstration of the fact that we're going to probably need a ceasefire pretty quickly on this sort of cancellation, because no Gen Z politician is going to be able to survive Oppo research. But I would agree that I don't think that we should violate the freedom of association of employers in order to rectify that. I think that we just need to extend more grace to young people who grew up online and found themselves in a way that is strangely recorded in a manner that it never would have been in previous generations.
That takes leadership on the part of people who have the power.
Absolutely.
Right, to fire and hire.
Absolutely. And there have been a few positive glimmers of hope. I think like there was a big protest at Netflix when over a Dave Chappelle documentary, and the leadership there said like we're a platform for expression. You don't have to agree with all the viewpoints, but if you don't have the capacity for that tolerance, then you can walk. And I do think that there has been a slight shift in corporations in taking those sorts of stances more often.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our program. I thank everyone for coming. I thank Rikki and Ian for participating in what I think was a pretty lively discussion. There will be a book signing in the foyer. Both authors have books. And thanks for coming out. Let's give ourselves a hand.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
That was so fun.
Still broadcasting.
Yes.